Hey there, Pascal from Western Canoe and Kayak. One of the great things about living in BC is that we have water, at least on the coast, that doesn't freeze all year round, right? So we have access to go paddling whenever we'd like. Summer, obviously, is when most people go paddling. It's nice and warm. It's great. But there's also something about paddling in the winter or the fall when it's a lot cooler. And that can be really enjoyable. There's the sense of solitude, quiet, but there's also an element of risk that goes with it. So today I want to talk about what you can wear to make it more safe to go out on the water. Right? So the big risk, if you end up in the water, is hypothermia, getting too cold. And that's what everybody focuses on. But it's not usually what causes people issues, at least not directly. Typically, if you go in the water, even when it's cold, you'll have a good amount of time before your core temperature drops to the point that your organs actually fail. i.e., the cold's not necessarily killing you, but it's what it does to your mobility, right? After a few minutes in the water, you'll lose dexterity in your hands. It can make it very difficult to get back in the boat. Your limbs will start getting weak. Not to sound too grim, but cold water needs to be taken seriously. The big risk, and I think the one that's paramount, is something called cold shock. So if you go in the water and it's too cold, there is a reflex to gasp. And if your head's under the water and you take a big gasp, you'll gulp in water, and that's no good, right? So we want to avoid cold shock. We want to prevent hypothermia, but we also want to be comfortable because it's not all doom and gloom, right? We want to have a good time when we're out there. Some other things that we need to bear in mind when we're paddling in the winter is there's more risk, not just because the weather might be worse, but also our overall exposure goes up. There's less people on the water. So that means response time in an emergency may be longer, right? So we need to be a bit more aware of ourselves and making sure that we're taking care of our own responsibility to be safe. So dressing for cold weather is a little bit tricky, right? At least around here, when it comes to be springtime or early summer, it can be really warm out as far as the sun being out and the air being warm, but the water is still cold, right? And when we get into fall, the air can be quite pleasant, but the water is really, really chilly. So we need to strike that balance between being safe enough if we go in the water and not being so hot that we're drenched in sweat and miserable when we're out paddling. So a few things that we need to take into account is what our risk is, right? If we're just paddling on a small local lake, we may be able to get away without too much. We might not need a dry suit if we're capable of having a cold and miserable walk back to the car, right? But if we're going farther from shore, if we're just being a bit more adventurous, then that's where it starts to make sense to bring in more layers, wear a dry suit, or some other kind of immersion gear. It is a balance, right, between comfort and safety. And at least for me, when I do that mental arithmetic, I always aim for safety. So now let's talk about some of the specific articles of clothing that we might wear when we head out for, say, a nice winter day of paddling. So here I've got some nice merino wool base layers. These are what I prefer. They're nice and warm, they're soft against my skin, and if I'm going out for multiple days, they don't start to smell too bad, at least not for a few days. So these are my preferred base layer. All right, so now I've got my base layers. They wick moisture away as I sweat. They keep me somewhat warm, but mostly these are just giving me a nice comfy layer against my skin. When I want to add layers of insulation, that's when I would maybe consider something like these expedition weight pants by NRS. Nice and cozy, fleecy on the inside. Those are a great option. They also make the same in a top. And they have different thicknesses, so you can play around with how much warmth you need, and you can kind of build a whole wardrobe of what's appropriate for the given conditions. Another option that works really nice, particularly when you're paddling in quite cold conditions, is to go for something like a union suit. This is basically a onesie, covers you from basically neck down to your toes. The great thing about that is as you're paddling and your body is twisting, sometimes there's a tendency for your shirt to ride up. And if you've ever had the feeling of a cold dry suit pressing right against your kidneys, you know you don't want to repeat that feeling. Another option, particularly if you're just getting into the sport and you don't want to spend all your money on more paddling gear, is to just wear inexpensive, regular fleece. This is just, I believe, acrylic, but it's nice and thick. Mostly what we want is that air layer. So the thicker your layers are, the more you're going to trap warm air. So I've got a top, and I also have a pair of fleece pants. Really, these are only appropriate when it's like below freezing. They're very, very warm. They're also fairly bulky, and that's the advantage of some of the paddling specific ones. They're less likely to chafe or make you uncomfortable when you're on the water. All right, now I'm feeling quite cozy, but there's still one layer missing, right? If I go into the water now, I'll get soaked. And these layers, merino wool and synthetics, they'll still keep you warm when you're wet, but it's going to be relatively warm, right? If we were wearing cotton, we'd be freezing because it would radiate all our heat away. These are going to do their best to keep me warm, but if I'm fully soaked in ice water, it's going to be very unpleasant. So the next step is a dry suit. So if you are going to opt for regular fleece, you want to be mindful if you're wearing a dry suit that you have something with a regular collar, not something that's got a high neck, because that's going to interfere with the gasket of the dry suit. So when putting on a dry suit, we want to make sure that we've tucked away any bits of jewelry, anything that might cause damage to the gaskets. They're tricky to get in, but being a little bit careful, making sure we don't damage the gaskets is super important. It's always a bit awkward the first time you put on a dry suit. There's no graceful way to do it. But with practice, it gets easier. Then we just want to make sure that we burp out all the air, so we're not a giant balloon when we go in the water. All right, next up we want to put on some footwear. Dry suits have socks that are relatively delicate. We don't want to be walking around on rocks or sand and poking holes in our dry suit socks. So here I'm using NRS boundary boots. My feet tend to run pretty cold, so I like the extra insulation that these provide, and they keep my ankles nice and warm. Because they're so tall, I have to tuck the pant leg into them. If you're using a shorter boot, if you don't need that much warmth for your feet, you can get away with wearing a shorter pair of boots and just tuck in the cuff of the pant over top, and that works just as well. But I really like these. I've been using them for a few years now, and they keep my feet nice and warm, and they are some of my favorite pieces of gear. All right, hands are another thing that we want to keep nice and warm. There's a tendency for hands to get wet when you're paddling, particularly when you're using kayak paddles. So gloves are one option. They work relatively well. They keep your dexterity high. I prefer pogies. If you haven't seen pogies before, they mount right onto the paddle shaft, and then you can slip your hands into them. Take them out easily if you need to, but it lets you have bare hands on the paddle shaft. You still get that great sense of control, and they are honestly some of the warmest options. So I am a real big fan of these. These are the NRS clutch pogies. They are incredibly warm. So if you're going out in frigid conditions, they're what I would recommend 100%. And some people have a bit of a worry that their hands are going to get stuck if they need to get out in a hurry, but it's really easy to slip these on and off. They're a great piece of kit. And for those times where I'm going to be really cold, if I'm practicing rolling or if I'm going out in really adverse conditions, I will don this storm hood. It is, as you can see, extremely fashionable, but it is very warm, especially if my head's going to be underwater regularly for extended periods of time. So there we are, ready to be out in the worst conditions imaginable. All right, now that I'm dressed in normal clothes, got really hot in that dry suit indoors. They work great, but when you're sitting inside a room at room temperature, it is hot in a hurry. One of the things I didn't touch on that is perhaps the most important though, is a properly fitted PFD. So I've got mine here, it's seen many, many miles. But having a flotation device means that if you are, worst case scenario, separated from your kayak, you don't have to expend the energy treading water. And if you can tuck yourself into a ball, you'll save a lot of heat and it'll really stretch out your survivability. Ultimately, like, we want people to be safe on the water. I know talking about risks is no fun, but there are some real risks in the winter. So wear your PFD, wear it in the summer too, but especially when it's cold out. The other thing that's important to think about is being a bit more mindful about the conditions, right? Weather can turn in a hurry, especially in the winter, right? Everything's just a bit more serious when it's cold out. There's a bit more risk, there's a bit more consequence. So making sure that we're wearing appropriate gear, that we've got our safety gear, our PFD, a VHF radio if you're certified to use it, maybe a cell phone in a case or a satellite communicator. Like, just be mindful that you're likely to be more isolated when you're paddling in the winter. So that responsibility and that safety becomes much more your responsibility. Finally, I just want to mention the importance of bringing snacks. I know it sounds silly, but in wintertime, the thing that's going to keep us the warmest is our metabolic furnace, right? So make sure that you bring some high-calorie snacks, especially if you're working hard on the water. A thermos with some hot tea or coffee or hot chocolate can go a long way in making paddling more comfortable. So if you've got any comments, anything you'd like to add, thoughts, suggestions, leave them in the comments below. If you'd like to see more videos like this covering a wide variety of topics, hit the subscribe button. We appreciate any like button hitting. It's all good stuff. So we'll see you in the next video.